All right. So we are sharing some of the how-tos of the best practices, some different ideas and frameworks for community-based advocacy. But we are really putting ourselves out there in the public sphere, seeking to change hearts and minds, but also policies and practices. So, where does this idea of the advocate come from? Well, we actually have writings as early as the fabulous philosopher Aristotle, and some of the writings and the rhetoric and the philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. The idea of the effective advocate, according to Aristotle, is the practice of logos, ethos, and pathos, their integration in a speaker seeking to bring others to share a viewpoint or perspective. Um, Logos, the first characteristic of effective advocacy, is logic and reasoning. Your advocacy should be understandable to other folks. How you got there is as important as what is the desired result. If you want to win folks over who do not have the same belief of this should be the desired result, a key aspect of advocacy is explaining why you believe that should be the desired result. And as common sense as that may sound, there are quite a few individuals who are simply so passionate about their topic, about their desired result, that they assume those who they are speaking with should share that belief. And that as soon as they put out, well, clearly this is what we need to do for our kids. Clearly, this is what we need to do for our community. But that centering of self in terms of motivation undermines potentially successful advocacy. When we go into a presentation, a conversation, a meeting, we need to assume that the person we are speaking with or the people we are speaking with have no idea how or why we got to our desired result, and have a logical, sequential, easy followable, right, accessible language, minimal in speak, data driven, practical, lived example illustrating way of saying, this is how I got to the idea that this is the best result for our community or our shared people of concern. We also want to establish credibility for the speaker. This does not mean you need to have a flawless life and be the best person. It means that before you present your compelling argument, it's always a great practice to say, this is why I'm speaking to this issue, as opposed to someone else. This is where I received the knowledge. This is the experience that I have. These are the organizations I partner with. This is because I live in this community, right? This is also part of cultivating an affinity bias or a halo effect bias. If we have that bias in play, people feel they have something in common with you. People feel like you are an authority. That's the halo effect. If there's a certain level of respect or credibility around you, then the things you say are more likely to be taken seriously or valued. So if you name, these are the organizations I'm partnered with, this is the community that I'm from, this is the family that I'm from. This is part of why we need to know and do our research about who we're speaking with, because we need to know what's important to them and what they value. Once we know what is important and what they value, we can use that in our introduction, in our meeting and relationship building to establish credibility with them, and also to establish a sense of connection, why we should be taken seriously, why we might be credible, not just as authorities in the field in which we are speaking, but credible to them as individuals. That's why I mention them separately. It's wonderful to get in front of a group of people and say, I want to speak about diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, belonging. And explain all my vast experience, research, years of work in that field. But if people do not believe that DEIA/B is a valid field, all of my years of experience mean nothing. So I need to know what's important to them and why they might be interested and willing to invest in me, as well as the experience that I have in the topic upon which I am speaking, or the lived experience that offers some validity to my viewpoint. And part of that connects with the third pillar of the art of advocacy, according to the philosopher Aristotle, which is pathos, the emotional appeal of the speaker. That's a big part of why mandatory trainings can be as much as 90% ineffective, right? If there's not emotional buy-in, if there's not a sense of relationship and connection, then there is not going to be the same buy-in, the same investment of the listener. It's often something we encounter in public rallies or in public actions. There'll be speakers, legislators, important people, folks who are credible, but they'll be mixed in with a poet, a musician, a child sharing a simple story, a vulnerable, marginalized person telling their personal experience, right? Folks that are meant intentionally, strategically to tug on the heartstrings, to offer that first person experience, which does add credibility for certain viewers or certain invested individuals, but also that creates an emotional buy-in, a sense of empathy, a sense of humanity to an issue that we might otherwise intellectualize. Having that emotional component to advocacy is essential. And that is reinforced if you're writing a letter to the editor, make sure you include a personal example, not just data and statistics. If you're doing a public action, have a speaker with lived experience, some sort of arts, some sort of personal sharing, some sort of more vulnerable person who might trigger empathy as part of the presentation, not just credibility experts or people in authority. If you are doing a workshop or an educational outreach, invite people to share, invite people to tell personal stories, invite people to do icebreakers or activities in which they break into small groups or pairs, partner up so that they can create an emotional investment, an emotional buy-in simply with others in the space in a way that will encourage them to be kinder, be more thoughtful with the words that they use. And that vulnerability as a facilitator or as a conversation or space holder also encourages people to buy in with you. It encourages a certain level of investment, trust, safety, and comfort. So the art of advocacy, what do we want to be thinking of as core components, no matter what the action or the modality is? Making sure that we are working in our logic and reasoning, how we got there, that we're establishing our credibility, both around our topic and around why the individual we're speaking to should care what we have to say. And then also making sure to appeal to an individual's intellect and logic, but also their heart and their emotions. So as we move into framing advocacy initiatives or efforts, there's 3 questions that we want to start with before we decide what to do. This is another common challenge that advocates encounter. We come up with the action we want to do before we actually have a thorough investigation of the problem. Let's hold a class. Let's have a rally. Let's do a public action. Well, is that actually the most effective way to reach the people with the power to support what it is that we want as our end result? It might not be. So before we choose our modality, before we choose the action, we want to step back and make sure that we are framing the conversation with some key questions. What is it that we want? Something ambiguous, something very general, like, I want to end racism. That's a lovely start. But what would ending racism look like in this time, in this place, with these people, with this organization, right? What is the end result that we want? And then why is it that we want that? Because that's going to help us develop our arguments and the logic and the reasoning that we use, not just what we want, but why we want it. But then we need to identify who has the power to influence that reality coming to be. And that leads to the logical follow up question of, and what's the best way to reach those individuals? If there's a very small group of people that have influence over a situation, then we can do research into the places and spaces those individuals are, the things they care about. If we need critical mass, we need a much larger group of people, then we want to think about community engagement or strategic communication plans to do awareness raising and education in a larger group. What are the core values? What are the individual beliefs? What are the priorities of the group of people we're trying to reach? We need to know who our target is and then choose the effective action for how to interact most successfully with that target. Practical example, creation care. I want to save the planet. Okay, well, what are the biggest issues around the planet not doing so well? We do our research. We actually do some learning. Well, I'm actually really concerned about the pollution of water, about water being something that we need as humans to drink, to bathe, as something that our animals that we eat need to drink and bathe, as something that feeds the crops and the land. Nothing works without water. So I want clean water. That's a great start. Awesome. What's the cause of clean water not occurring? Well, a lot of clean water is being polluted by toxic dumping. A lot of clean water is actually being bottled and or taken out of the ground and not being replenished or not being allowed to be replenished. Okay, we have a few ways that our clean water sources are now being polluted. So who has the power to do something about that? Well, I mean, it's all of our problem. So let's talk to everyone and tell them to stop throwing trash out the window and having it get to the water. Let's make sure that we're doing an anti-littering campaign, that we're talking about farming, and we're talking about pesticides. We're talking about shower beads, and not dumping our medicine in the trash or down the sink. Well, as wonderful awareness raising issues as whether or not you are using facial scrub that has microplastics in it, the truth is that the vast majority of percentage of water pollution comes from a handful of very large corporations that are given government exemptions to dump into and pollute their factory waste into our oceans and our waterways. So deciding on local community education, saying we need to ride bikes, have water bottles, and change our face wash, that's beautiful awareness raising to help people understand that creation care is important. But is it actually going to make a tangible change that's going to improve the health of our waterways? Not really. Not if we don't make sure that the toxic dumping that's happening from a handful of large corporations stops. So, deciding where we want to target our advocacy and who are the people that have the power to do that, that's a very different group of folks. It's a very different group of invested individuals, right? It's a very different set of education for ourselves. So we can choose who has the power to do what we want to do. But then we might also say, you know what? I know that I'm not going to be around forever. And I only have so much reach and so much energy. I can't take on big corporations by myself. What I want to do is raise a generation of climate care advocates. I want to make sure that young people are involved and invested. How do I convince young people to care about the planet? Well, that might not involve getting to know who are the heads of what corporations and being engaged in boycotts, being engaged in letter writing or legislative visits and advocacy. That might include being involved in community education, in partnering with youth programs, in promoting things like water bottles, bike rides, and putting together health and beauty packages, encouraging earth-friendly product usage, because those things raise awareness in young people to make sure that they're thinking about climate justice and climate care on a daily basis and are more likely to vote accordingly then, or be open and willing to participate in larger scale advocacy. So, who is your audience? Who is your long-term audience and your short-term audience? These are important questions to ask because they completely change the activity and the messaging. Does that make sense? The illustration of, are we looking at what we want to do in the short term, the long term, who we need as partners, what kind of culture we want to cultivate, and how we are doing a power assessment to strategically decide how to interact around our advocacy. So, how do we, once we know who we're talking to, put together effective movements and areas of advocacy, awareness raising, and education? How do we do that legislative visit, or speak at that school board meeting, or write that letter to the editor, still the most read portion of newspapers? How do we make sure that the advocacy statement we're putting out in front of people with influence or people we're recruiting to join us in advocacy and create a critical mass of awareness and educated, committed individuals? Well, the first thing is doing our research, knowing our facts. The second is making sure that we are receiving direction from individuals that we want to help. Who are the affected people in the area of justice that we are seeking? We cannot effectively do advocacy around racial justice if we're not talking to folks who are the most harmed by racism. We cannot talk about the mistreatment or the lack of justice around refugee and immigration policies without actually consulting with the lived experience of refugees, those seeking asylum, and immigrants. We cannot talk about LGBTQIA plus justice and equal rights, marriage equality, if we're not actually speaking to LGBTQIA plus people, folks who can give us the inside lived experience track of these are the real challenges that we need addressed. And then it also helps us establish priorities. This is actually the bigger issue that we're dealing with on a daily basis, not this thing. This actually is affecting more of us. This thing might be very dramatic as a news story, but it doesn't affect nearly as many of us as this thing that might seem less dramatic, but actually has a much more devastating reach because of its frequency. To do that, to get that level of honesty and transparency, It becomes vital for us to build relationships that are transformational, not only transactional. What's the difference between a transactional relationship and a transformational relationship? A transactional relationship is I give you something, you give me something in return. You do something, I give you something as reward or payment. It is about the result. We are not changed by that. We are not emotionally, spiritually affected by a transactional relationship. It is not about the person so much as it is about getting a desired result. From that desired result, we may move forward. It may be helpful. We may need to do things in our advocacy, like we pay money to someone who designs a flyer or prints a flyer, who makes a sign. But are those individuals necessarily changed by that sign making? Maybe not. Did we actually advance our cause in paying someone in a transactional way to print up a sign? No. That's why a big part of transformational community-based advocacy is involving people actively and relationally in every step. Because sign making parties can be a huge part of awareness raising, as much as the march where those signs are carried. Because rehearsals for the dance in or the songs that will be sung, translating and working with individuals to say, how are we going to speak in different languages and have someone translate? Let's work together to write these speeches or these connecting words, right? In the planning is actually a lot of the relationship building. In the post-processing is where a lot of the care that the strain of advocacy can cause is given. And if we have intentional spaces for both preparation and training and for aftercare, what we do is create sustainable advocates. If we just want people to show up, but we don't have relationship enough to be able to equip them beforehand and follow up with them after, what we end up with is burned out individuals who are minimally engaged and who will not participate again, which we need repeat participants for sustained long game advocacy. And we also want individuals who, when they participate with us, will be equipped to invite others to participate with us. Which means that even if we are going to a restaurant to get food, how are we sharing what that food's going to be used for? Even if we're just getting signs, even if we're just printing up booklets, even if we're arranging for transportation, how are we using that as part of the advocacy so that we can engage individuals who are now equipped to tell the story to the next person who gets in their Uber, the next person who comes in and asks for something printed, the next catering client. So every part of the interaction, every person becomes a potential contributor to the movement. And I promise you, when you think of that, it changes the way that we speak to people when we are in service to an issue. So, what are some of the ways that once we have done that preparation and that follow-up, that lead in and the preparation for aftercare, we're now in the meeting. We are giving the speech on the steps. We are meeting with the legislator. We are writing the letter. We are standing on the doorstep of the neighbor or community individual we want to sign our petition. The short version of this is the 3 C's. Connect, communicate, and collaborate in this case. The first thing we want to do is establish connection, relationship, a sense of safety and familiarity. Next, we communicate clearly what is the desired result, what is the concrete ask. Why do we want that? And then we invite people to participate, right? Here's why we're here. Here's what we're about. Here's what matters and is important. And here's how you can be a part of it. And then we open ourselves to receive feedback because we are co creating this work with individuals. They are not just a signature, a vote, a commitment. They are collaborators in something that also affects their community, their neighborhood, their organization, their families, their friend circles. And one of the other important things that's part of connecting and communicating, which is why it's between the two, is the regulation of our emotions. Now, an extreme example of this, and I will content notice you, I'm going to be talking about violence against marginalized people. Care for yourself in the space. And I know this can be hard to remember, right? But a huge part of what made the freedom rides, the sit-ins at lunch counters successful was that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the leaders of that freedom movement in the 60s, they did extensive training on emotional control before public demonstrations, right? And we're talking putting these Black people, white as well, allies as well, on their knees on basement floors and shouting insults at them, throwing food scraps at them, yelling at them in every imaginable hurtful way until individuals could receive that treatment and not react. Because Dr. King and his collaborators were aware that as soon as police, as law enforcement, as bystanders with vigilantism on the brain had the excuse, they would absolutely disrupt and end the public demonstration by going in with violence, hurting and harming the demonstrators, which would make it harder to recruit more demonstrators. It would reduce the impact because it would shorten and end the public action, reduce the opportunity for media coverage and public awareness being raised, right? Nonviolence isn't just about a spiritual or philosophical way to be. It's also about practically avoiding harm and injury, being able to recruit and bring more people into the movement, more safely engage vulnerable people and folks of different ages, and also being able to sustain the movement or the demonstration or public action longer, which raises your ability to have media coverage and community interaction. As soon as demonstrations or public actions turn physical or violent, they are generally ended fairly quickly. And so using nonviolence as a tactic allowed those demonstrations to become the media juggernaut that they were. The ability of participants to manage their emotions became essential for the success of that movement. Gandhi's demonstrations, another significant example, Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid advocacy and public action, another important example. A great many of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations after the death of George Floyd, significant examples. Advocacy is about issues that are personal to people. They are emotional. But not only does having an emotional response that is uncontrolled put the advocate and other fellow advocates in potential danger and potentially undermine or reduce the impact of the action, what it also does is take us all the way back to that first slide. Remember how we talked about establishing credibility, promoting that halo effect or that affinity bias with the people in power who we need to win over to our side? If we become easily dismissible, if we are seen as overly emotional or uncontrolled in our emotional response, we are now no longer seen as being logical and reasonable, and we are easily dismissible. Now, is that accurate? No. Our rage is real. It is often deserved. Our emotions are valid. But we want to be effective, and we want to keep our marginalized communities safe. That doesn't mean we don't show emotions or we deny our emotions, but it means that we are strategic in how we express them and how we share them, with whom we share them, in what spaces we share them, so that they are in service to the movement, not undermining it. Do not demonize your emotions or tell yourself that you do not have the right to have them, and definitely do not let anyone else tell you that you do not have the right to be angry, because there is so much to be angry about when it comes to how our marginalized siblings are treated, the access, opportunity, and human rights honoring that are happening in today's world. We have reason to be emotional. But as advocates, not as humans, we need to take time to just be human. But when we are specifically in the role of advocate, that space, that managed and intentional space, is about determining how our emotions can be shared and shown in ways that are effective contributors to the cause. So, how do we learn to manage those emotions in ways that are going to help us not be stuffing our emotions and feelings down in ways that can be hurtful, harmful, contribute to burnout, exhaustion, or grief? We can hone and practice our skills. Practice, 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 right? Skills that will help us as advocates are preparation and strategy, right? Learning those facts, practicing managing our emotions, envisioning what might reasonably occur as we're engaged in action, and having an idea of how we're going to handle that beforehand. We will feel safer and more comfortable. We will feel equipped and prepared if we have those strategic and preparatory conversations beforehand, which means that even if things occur that, as we say, go left, we will have already prepared and talked about that. So now our logic brain will stay engaged as opposed to us going into trauma response. We don't want to go into trauma response when engaging in advocacy, because that's when we fight, we flee, we fawn, right? We freeze. We don't want to have those trauma responses when we are in an active advocacy space. So to avoid that, to stay in our logic brain, preparation and strategy, so that we have already thought about and prepared for the challenges, that will really help us feel safer, feel more prepared and ready. And we will have responses that we've already rehearsed physically and just by thinking about them repeatedly, so that we won't go into panic mode. Panic and advocate, not a good pairing, right? We also want to practice the skill of engaging communication. It's important to share our facts and know our facts, but engaging communication, using the appropriate vocabulary, that's part of knowing how to promote investment, create a sense of conversation and exchange. If we can explain things to folks in ways they can easily understand, they don't check out as quickly, they don't get fatigued as quickly to where their brain clicks off and their short-term memory stops occurring and stops working. The engaging communication keeps people involved and invested, and will actually help our point get across in a quicker and more effective way. We also want to cultivate our empathy, our emotional intelligence, because if we have the empathy of being able to put ourselves in the shoes of those we are speaking to, even if they're people with whom we wildly disagree, we can pivot arguments effectively on the spot. Oh, you know what? Is this why you are resisting this idea? Is this part of why this is a struggle for you? I pick up on that. Here's how I can counter that with an effective, meaningful argument. Being able to put ourselves in the shoes of another individual, which we can learn some of that through the research about our target group and those we're speaking to, but also just practicing the skill of empathy, doing things as simple as reading memoirs and biographies, first person stories and narratives, um, making other people's experiences besides our own real to us in an emotional way. That helps us strengthen our empathy muscles. And when our empathy muscles are strengthened, when we receive pushback from folks who think or believe differently than we do, we can pivot and use language or scenarios that are more meaningful to them. If we have no sense of connection, if we're not able to establish any sense of connection with those we are speaking with or interacting with, we're not going to be able to overcome a barrier when we encounter it. Also, practicing the art of questioning. A lot of advocates, we want to memorize our talking points and memorize our key asks, but do we also know how to challenge through inviting someone that we are speaking to defend their viewpoint, asking them to share their facts, their logic? Are we inviting them to unpack some of their beliefs in ways that will reveal themselves to the neutral watchers, to the folks in the crowd who may not have made up their mind? We don't just want to be speaking and putting our viewpoint out. We also want to be intentionally, strategically questioning and inviting those that we're speaking to reveal themselves when we're given the opportunity. They might reveal weaknesses, they might reveal key asks or needs, they might reveal weaknesses or holes in their argument or logic. They might break down into an emotional response that undermines their credibility. The more we can be intentional and strategic with our questioning, the more we can have a helpful interaction in an advocacy space. And then it also comes to the win, right? Recognizing that the idea of there being a winner and a loser when we are part of the same community at the end of the day, frequently, that is white supremacy culture. What does a win for us all look like? What do people getting what they need looks like? When we go into an advocacy space, do we have an ideal solution, but also several compromises? Are we willing to engage in alternate resolutions? Do we have practice in compromise, flexibility, the ability to figure out what are multiple ways we could get our core ask met? That will help us be much more effective in our advocacy. We have shared and talked about a lot of the forms of advocacy that we engage in. We know that awareness raising can take place with public actions. It can take place with cultural events. It can take place with film nights. And we can do advocacy by speaking at meetings and going to places where decisions are being made, legislative visits, letters to the editor, that awareness, that education, that applying strategic pressure to decision makers. That can be done in countless ways. One of my favorite ways to help explain that to people so that they can brainstorm what might be the most effective way, right? We talked about that in one of our first slides. Figure out who are the people in power that you want to move. But then you've got to determine what are the most effective ways to reach them and recognize that you may want more than one, right? Unfortunately, very few people, when you simply approach them and say, there is actually a more equitable, human rights affirming way of doing that, you might want to make that switch. You know what? Yes, let me surrender some of the power, control, and resource that I have for the good of humanity. Let's do that right away. That would be awesome if it was a regular occurrence in advocacy. But even when it's just individuals who are tired and doing things status quo is simply easiest, are still reluctant to change, even relatively simple changes. It's just easier to stay the same, to maintain a status quo. So having multiple points to apply pressure is going to make it more uncomfortable to be in that status quo. So that's a big part of why there may be one way that is clearly most effective, but in effective advocacy, we usually want to have multiple points of pressure to strategically apply so that it just becomes more uncomfortable to preserve what has been than to at least have the conversation about what might be. Or it just make it so uncomfortable that people do not run for reelection. That can work too. I'm going to share my screen here. And the actually Black Panther Party are my favorite for this in terms of just what are 6 easy ways that we can make this concept explainable to other folks that we want to engage. The 6 Ps, as how the Black Panther Party describes the categories of tactics for advocacy, are programs, protests, projects of survival, press work, political education, and planning. Right? Programs. What were some of the programs that the Black Panther Party used as active resistance against racism and oppression? Any of you know some of my history buffs?
Wouldn't they use a lot of like educational, like reaching out to the younger children, doing like food banks and stuff like that for kiddos?
Yep. So they Saturday school was part of the Black Panther movement, where they actually taught essentially corrective history. Here's stories of Black liberation, here's stories of African history, creating resourceful, resilient, well-educated, healthy individuals who could participate actively in the movement. Saturday school was a wonderful way to work with young people. They did GED programs and supported continuing education at really all levels. Did a lot of work with women who may not have had access to the same educational opportunities because of the time. Financial education was key to them. Here's how to work credit, banking, budgets, savings. So financial education was something that was very frequently seen in some of the adult schools. Every new Black Panther recruit took classes, not just went to meetings. It was about how can we empower and enrich your life as a person of value. And those programs created a level of investment, but were also not just community builders and investments for stakeholders, they were acts of resistance It was how can we mitigate the harm that's been done? How can we create and be part of proactively building a different reality than what has existed for the marginalized people we are seeking to support? There were, of course, protests, public action. These are a big part of raising awareness, getting attention so that you can do the education. You can't educate folks if you don't have their attention. So protests and public actions, they also can be seen as disruptors, things that interrupt the status quo enough that it makes people pay attention. Now, a lot of the things like the free breakfast program, safe transportation and self-policing of neighborhoods, the following of police officers and monitoring them to make sure they weren't overly aggressively policing Black neighborhoods. These were part of projects of survival. That marginalized individuals, if they have safety challenges or basic health challenges, if they have issues with housing, transportation, childcare, food, medical care access, how much protesting are they able to do? How much focus and participation are they able to bring to programs? And are they going to be sustainable advocates as you're thinking about growing the work? No. So projects of survival are part of every long-term successful movement. For example, even the Montgomery bus boycott, folks don't talk about how the Montgomery bus boycott was supported by a massive infrastructure of carpoolers who continued to say, we will find ways to get you to work so you can pay your bills while you are boycotting the bus. The bus boycott was a great protest, but without supportive projects of survival, it would have folded far before it did, because people that are marginalized already have reduced resources. So those projects of survival are what allow individuals to participate in boycotts, in walk-offs, in strikes, in those disruption activities. Projects of survival can look like bail funds. They can look like chaplaincy, mental health support. What do marginalized individuals with less access, opportunity, resource, how can we support those individuals ongoing and engaged and healthy, sustainable participation in movement work? So a big part of the Black Panthers work involved childcare during programs and protests. And that was just as essential to the success and growth of the movement as the programs and the protests. Press work, that's press releases, it's getting coverage of the protests, it's advertising the programs, it's surveys around what's needed for the project of survival. It's once you've got the attention of the protests, how are you following up? Are you getting people's contact information? Are there people walking around with clipboards getting email addresses when you do protests? Because if not, you're missing a significant part of the tactical strategic work. That's another frequent mistake that advocates make. They'll turn out 100 people for a fabulous event. And I'm like, okay, are you walking away with 100 emails for continued engagement and next steps? Well, no. Okay, then you missed a huge opportunity for future advocacy, because now we're going to be reinventing the wheel for each and every event instead of building and increasing capacity. Press work is about getting newspaper coverage. It's about getting radio coverage. It's about getting television coverage. It's about social media coverage and presence. It is also about how are we inviting people to engage in that work? How are we getting communication avenues set up for next steps? Are we asking people as part of our organizing, as part of our programs? Are we telling people at the protest from the stage, make sure to follow our Facebook page? Are we writing books, booklets, pamphlets that we're selling or giving away at events? Do we have downloadable resources that are part of our trainings? What are people taking away from every interaction around advocacy that will contribute to their continued engagement in the movement? All of that is press work. Press work is communication, sustained and ongoing relationship building communication. Political education is slightly different than the education that enriches the community and reduces the marginalization of a population. Political education is about the systems of oppression and how we dismantle them. Right? We need to know, if we're talking about changing laws, how the law works, how donations are handled. We're spotting weaknesses, we're spotting openness, we're spotting avenues for engagement. We are finding ways to reach out and finding ways to make change so that we can strategically and intentionally target where to place our pressure and where to do the work. We need political education, not just around how general government works, but how does decision making happen? Structure and governance of the targeted organization. Political education is learning the structure and governance of the targeted organization. How do power holders make decisions and have the resources to carry out their actions? Making sure that our strategic thinkers know about that is key, right? And the final P with the Black Panther movement was the importance of the plan over centering around key personalities. Now, this has been a very difficult part of movement work forever, right? We have some beautiful work that, for example, Martin Luther King is just a very frequent and easy example that Martin Luther King was part of. Solid foundation, strong team behind him. But Martin Luther King was very much the predominant face of that work. And after Martin Luther King's assassination, it didn't take long for that movement to fall apart. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement is another example of where there was specifically not a single personality that was the head of that movement. It was very much about local organizers and leaders. But part of the challenge there was not a clear plan. What is the path to victory? What are the specific asks that are minimal, understandable, actionable, achievable within a reasonable amount of time? And without having that strategic plan in place, even as different leadership changed, the movement still eventually lost momentum. We do need strong leaders, but we need those strong leaders to focus on creating strategic plans for actionable, achievable results. You can have multiple strategic plans. Ending racism is not a strategic plan. Ending racism can be a vision, but you also need a mission. And then you need a strategic plan with SMART goals on what can you achieve in a reasonable amount of time in your geographic location, in your sphere of influence. People need successes to stay motivated. We need to have a reasonable focus for our advocacy. Otherwise, we will lose momentum. People will become discouraged over time. They will drop out, and that will be the end of the work, at least in that manifestation. Organizations, in our LGBTQ conversations, we have talked about some of the organizations like PFLAG and GLAD, that the Trevor Project, that have gotten national reach and have lasted for many, many years because they have very specific missions. They want to end homophobia and create quality of life for LGBTQ individuals, but they are picking specific areas of focus and expertise, developing a team around those specific areas, and creating specific strategic plans that they refresh every 3 to 5 years as they adapt to what's happening in the political sphere. They have regular communication plans, they have programs, they provide projects of survival, they have excellent press work, they have educational opportunities, but the emphasis is not on personalities or individual people. It is on branding, it is on clear communication and identity. The organization, the movement, the work has a personality, but it's just not individuals that things center on, because individuals move on for lots of reasons. But what they do have are specific missions as well as visions, and they have strategic plans that are around an achievable area that they are equipped to engage around. So I love the idea of how many of you have already spoken around these are some of the things that I could think about in terms of being more strategic, being more intentional, focusing on what are the concrete changes that I want to observe underneath the broader vision, right? I might care about healthcare. I might care about education. I might care about political engagement. But what in my place, in my space, with my people, with my sphere of influence, with my resource and time, can I reasonably accomplish? What do I still need? Who do I still need? Who am I targeting? What is the plan around how to engage and bring more people in a transactional to the side, transformational to the center type of way? And how do I continue to grow that movement, applying pressure in multiple points on the people and positions of power, making it uncomfortable enough that they are willing to surrender the status quo so that we can make adaptive, flexible movements and make those forward steps to get to a place of greater justice.